When Brandon Ebel showed up for a meeting with his grandfather, he was pretty terrified. His grandfather was a hard man who expected great things from Brandon, but he probably wasn't expecting Brandon to ask for $100,000 to start a record label. But since every bank had already rejected Brandon, what choice did he have? His grandfather wasn't willing to put up the whole $100,000. He barely understood what Brandon even wanted to do, but he believed in his grandson. He might have been the only person in the entire world who did, so he offered him a much smaller loan. Brandon took that money and completely changed the Christian music industry, launched the careers of genre-defining punk bands, and created a whole lot of controversy along the way. This is the story of Tooth and Nail Records. I know this might be kind of a different style of video for me, but I've always been very fascinated about Tooth and Nail Records. I kind of grew up with that label, so I wanted to dig more into the history of it and kind of see where it came from and what happened to it. So if you end up enjoying this video, please consider subscribing. I talk about a whole host of different music history topics on this channel, and I'm trying my best to learn music history along the way. If you end up enjoying the video, please consider giving it a like, and if you want to become a member and have a more direct impact on the future of this channel, there's a link in the description below for that. Tooth and Nail Records started when Brandon Ebel, a graduate of Oregon State University and the son of a pastor, had the idea to try and merge the exciting music of punk that he loved with his Christian upbringing and his faith. Brandon was born in Dallas, but after a stop in California, he landed in Oregon when he was pretty young. In an interview with a Labeled podcast, he talked about his earliest introduction to Christian rock being a guy named Barry McDonald in this album called Cosmic Cowboy that his dad brought home when Brandon was around 7 years old. He was also interested in Keith Green, who was kind of like a hippie figure who converted to Christianity when he was 19 and went on to become essentially the godfather of Christian contemporary music. More than just the songs and the music, he was always really interested in audio equipment and piecing it all together, figuring out how it all worked. And he said that his interest in that, as well as his complete disinterest in anything school related, always made him feel like a bit of an outsider within his community. Though he was never rebellious. He called himself a good kid, said he always listened to his parents, never really disobeyed them all that much, which meant by the time he was a teenager, they allowed him to branch out and listen to more secular music. As a student at Oregon State, he had his own radio show, so we would go out and try to find these hardcore and punk bands. That's how he really got involved with the scene. That's how he made important connections that would kind of help him along the way as he started Tooth and Nail. After graduating, he interned at Virgin Records for a bit before joining Frontline Records, which was a Christian rock record label. Brandon said that he'd bring them these Christian punk artists to sign, and Frontline would completely ignore him. So that's what gave him the idea to start his own label for these artists that he knew could be something special if they were given the chance. He said, "To me, it was this ultimate niche that I was ultra familiar with. Cool music. I'm a Christian, but this doesn't sound like it's Christian music. It's its own thing." So these were the bands I started putting out. That quote is from the Labeled podcast that I mentioned earlier, and I just want to give a huge shout out to that podcast. It has some great stories with a lot of Tooth and Nail artists, as well as this fantastic interview with Brian Ebel that kind of dug into his background a little bit. So definitely recommend checking that out if you want more information. Once he had this idea, he knew that he would need help financing it. So he went to some of his dad's friends who were really wealthy entrepreneurial investor types, and he offered them ownership stake in this new label for a $100,000 loan. They all turned him down, so he kind of went to his grandfather as almost a last resort. He said that he had always had somewhat of a strained relationship with his grandfather. His grandfather was a hardworking man. He grew up kind of hard and tough, and Brandon said that he was always a little bit harder on him than maybe his other grandkids. Not really sure why, not sure if that's accurate. That was just his perception of things. But either way, his grandfather gave him a small loan, and he was able to start this new record label out of his tiny apartment in Irvine, California in 1993. He decided on calling it Tooth and Nail Records because he thought that sounded like a generic enough name that it could encompass all genres of music, and it means going all out on something. So it fit with what he was trying to do, just giving this label his all, not leaving anything on the table. People think that it has some religious undertones, like the nails in the cross or something like that, but it's not. It's just a phrase that he liked. The first release on the label was Wishing for Eden's pretty grunge-influenced album called Pet the Fish. I read somewhere that the band actually thought they were meeting to sign with a label called Blonde Vinyl, but instead signed with Tooth and Nail. Brandon first saw them while he was working for Frontline Records. They were opening at the Roxy for one of Frontline's artists. So Brandon was there at the Roxy to see one of Frontline's artists, and he was just blown away. That album was actually the band's only release, and they broke up not long after, and it's honestly kind of a forgettable band, but they will always have the distinction of being the first Tooth and Nail release and one of the artists that inspired Brandon to even start this whole label project to begin with. Through 1994, they released albums from Christian hardcore groups like Starflyer 59, Plank Eye, and Focused. These were bands that weren't destined to be massive successes in the industry or even really in the punk community, but they clearly showed what Tooth and Nail wanted to do. They wanted to create a space for these Christians who were making punk music, but didn't really have anywhere to go. So Tooth and Nail wanted to be a place for them to exist and do what they wanted to do without having to tailor that to fit into industry expectations. Before Tooth and Nail, there really wasn't room for them, either in the Christian music industry that was kind of scared of bands like this, or within punk that was a little bit too anti-establishment to welcome Christians in. There was another label called Victory that was signing some of the same style of bands, but they were less Christian-focused than Tooth and Nail was. One of those bands that I mentioned a second ago, Focused, was one of Brandon's inspirations for starting this label. When he first moved to California, he went to see them play in the basement of a church and was just blown away by both the music and the audience response to it. So he thought, that's something. There's something here. There's a culture here. There's a community here. Something can be built here. And when he brought that idea to Frontline, they completely turned it down. So he thought, if I ever do start a record label, that's the type of artist that I would want to sign. And he did. Brandon was able to meet with these bands like Wish for Eden and Focused through his friend Mike Knott, who was acting as the president of the label. It was kind of this shady undertaking, if I do say so myself. Brandon recognized that he was a complete unknown. No one knew who he was, who would agree to sign with him. He is not a thing in the industry. No one knows his label, but Mike Knott was a really respected Christian musician and Christian rocker. So these bands that knew Mike Knott would meet with Mike and not Brandon. So they would meet with Mike and think it was Mike's label that they were signing with and not Brandon's. So that's kind of how he got the meetings. That's how he got the bands to sign on with him. Eventually, Mike had to back out because it became too much, but the bands were already putting out records by that point, so it didn't slow much down. They were kind of already bought into the Tooth and Nail project. In the early days, Tooth and Nail gained a really important employee in Bill Power. He knew Brandon back from his college days when he was doing the radio show, and Bill was busy trying to promote a ton of really interesting underground bands in the Pacific Northwest. Through that, he met Brandon, and they stayed in touch when Brandon moved down to California. Bill was also in a band called Blenderhead that Brandon wanted to sign to Tooth and Nail. Bill remembers playing a show in California that Brandon attended, saying, "After the show, he offered me a record deal for Blenderhead. While we were recording that album, I convinced him to let me run his mail order. I was already running a small mail order for my releases from Seattle. That's how I got hired." This was when the label had about a dozen releases out. Bill would be a really important link for Tooth and Nail, especially in that slightly more indie underground world of the Pacific Northwest, and he really introduced Brandon and Tooth and Nail to some very exciting acts in the early days of Tooth and Nail. I think it's important to stop here and give a brief overall context of the state of Christian music at this point in time in the 90s and early 2000s, especially for middle schoolers, let's say. It was kind of dark times, honestly. The Christian music of that time was honestly very bad. It was very cheesy. It was very contemporary Christian worship music. So if you were into the more edgier, harder rock stuff, there wasn't Christian music like that for you. But also at the same time, your parents probably weren't going to let you listen to these hardcore punk bands like Minor Threat and Fugazi and Nirvana like that. You just weren't allowed to listen to that. So it left them kind of out in the wilderness with nothing to listen to. You were just trying to come up with anything that sounded vaguely Christian that your parents would let you listen to that wasn't terrible, frankly. There were a few bands out there like The Crucified, but nothing was centralized. It was hard to find distribution or set up tours, which meant it was hard for these middle schoolers in like the South or the Midwest to really know about these bands or get access to their music. And that was true of all of punk, but at least by the early 90s, there were some labels for punk music, some established touring routes, some like a little bit of a established DIY network for that hardcore punk music. For Christian punk, there was basically nothing. As a fan pointed out, when Tooth and Nail came around in the early 90s, it felt special. It felt momentous. It felt like something different. They wrote, "It was refreshing to finally see a label full of Christian artists that didn't bill themselves as a Christian label or use that as a crutch and or marketing tactic. It was refreshing to see a label operating in the Christian market that ostensibly released music for one simple reason, because they liked it, as opposed to its ministry potential or some other spiritual reason. But as a small label run out of an apartment with a $60,000 loan, they had to be pretty cheap." Brandon also, of course, lost his job when he started what could be seen as a rival label, so he had to live off of that loan money, and his grandfather was charging him pretty hefty interest, and he just was not able to pay any of it back because he invested everything back into the label trying to make the production better. Aaron Sprinkle introduced Brandon to this band out of Washington calling themselves Magnified Plaid. They had like a little 4-track demo tape that Aaron helped them record, and Aaron showed that to Brandon. Brandon set up a showcase with them, went to see them perform, and was blown away. So he signed the, at the time, high schoolers to a contract with Tooth and Nail. By the time their debut album came out in 1994, they were going by MxPx, and they became the most important band probably in the history of Tooth and Nail Records. MxPx was bigger than Christian rock or Christian punk. They were pretty popular in the mainstream skate punk scene in general, especially with their second album called Teenage Politics. They were getting MTV airplay, they were selling out shows, they were a big deal. Mike Herrera, who was the singer of MxPx, talked about how naive they were when they started, saying that they had no idea who Tooth and Nail even were. They'd never heard of the label. They were just excited to be able to record something. Brandon realized that they had something special with MxPx, so he focused on breaking them, sometimes to the detriment of other bands on the label. MxPx's third album, Life in General, was the biggest album the label ever put out at that point. But by 1997, MxPx had a falling out with Tooth and Nail and left the label, which had the potential to completely destroy everything they had built. Without the income that MxPx generated, Brandon was a little bit worried that Tooth and Nail wouldn't be able to actually exist anymore. Eventually, MxPx would come back, but by that point, it was a completely different label. Brandon had this idea of what Tooth and Nail could be, and by the mid-90s, that idea was starting to show a little bit of fruit. He explained his idea behind Tooth and Nail, saying, "My goal for Tooth and Nail was a base of fans that would buy all the records because they knew it was quality. They knew it was legitimate, because they knew it was special, and they were a part of something." And that idea was actually happening by the time that MxPx was on the label. They would send out this catalog of upcoming releases, and they had fans all over the country who would buy anything that Tooth and Nail released simply because Tooth and Nail released it, and they knew they liked the other stuff on the label. It was truly creating this community of Tooth and Nail Records fans, and Brandon was really proud of that, and it was really exciting for him. But as that niche grew, they also hit some pushback. The kind of music that these bands made felt too aggressive for Christian parents generally, and pastors specifically in the South weren't a fan of some of the bands. Brandon talked about getting criticism from pastors who didn't like certain lines and songs, and he thought that had nothing to do with him. He didn't write it, so why were they getting mad at him? So there was this disconnect between certain parts of the Christian audience who didn't approve of what they were trying to do with this punk music, but also non-Christian punk fans didn't really care for it all that much either. There was just something about the idea of it being Christian punk that didn't make sense for the more hardcore punk fans. It all felt a bit cheesy and strange and different. Even if some of the bands were actually pretty good, it just kind of felt off. There was a story of MxPx playing shows and people would throw burning Bibles at them. And in the No New Kind of Story documentary, some of the bands talked about bands like Modest Mouse pulling out of shows when they learned that the opener was on Tooth and Nail. Being on Tooth and Nail was starting to come with a stigma attached for these bands, so that by the time MxPx was leaving the band, it was kind of questionable whether or not the label could continue. They were losing their biggest cash cow. They were hitting this controversy both from the Christian market that they maybe should expect to find a home in, but also from the punk market, which was sort of rejecting their Christian attitude. So the label that MxPx ended up signing with had to pay Tooth and Nail Records some amount of money in order to sign MxPx. So Brandon took that money and decided, I'm going to invest all of this into another new band and see if I can get them mainstream success as well. The band that he chose to invest in was called the Orange County Supertones, who were kind of, as they explain in that documentary that, again, is fantastic, as well as the Labeled podcast. Also watch the No New Kind of Story documentary if you want to hear more of the band's behind the scenes of this early time of Tooth and Nail. Definitely a great documentary. Check that out as well. But in that documentary, they talk about how the Supertones kind of sucked. They weren't a good band. They were all over the place. They didn't have a consistent style. They got advice from other band members that told them, like, just focus in on something. So they started writing ska music, and that really stuck, and they actually became a pretty good band. So Brandon decided to focus everything in on the Orange County Supertones. And it worked. They became a massive success. The Supertone success allowed Brandon to actually pay off that original loan from his grandfather. As the label moved into the late 90s and the early 2000s, they continued pumping out records that weren't super commercially explosive, but they were from bands that became pretty influential within the scene. Bands like 90 Pound Wuss, Bon Voyage, and Training for Utopia. These were bands that essentially changed the Christian alternative music scene, I'd argue for the better, and paved the way for the label's real massive success in the next decade. 90 Pound Wuss in particular were a super interesting band, and their run of albums at the end of the 90s saw them go from skate punk to melodic punk to post-punk, all within this like 3 or 4 album trajectory. They broke up in 2000, but they were highly influential in that Southern California and West Coast punk scene. While MxPx was exploding, they also signed a few other Seattle-based bands, so Brandon decided to move the operation up north, mostly so he could be closer to his family. That also let Bill Power take a more active role in the label. In the mid-2000s, Brandon was taking a little bit of a step back from finding all of the bands that the label would sign, and that's when Bill Power started bringing in more groups. Some of the biggest success they had in the early 2000s came from what I would call a somewhat unlikely source. Jeremy Camp was not a punk artist. He wasn't a hardcore guy, but he scored Tooth and Nail Records 4 gold albums. Jeremy was a worship pastor around Southern California whose music career was on the verge of taking off. Then his wife passed away from cancer in 2001. She was only 21 years old. So at 23, he's wrestling with this idea that he was supposed to spend his life with this woman and God was going to heal her, and his music career is taking off, and then all of that seemed to just crash down. It was all very heavy, and he used that experience to write some truly heartbreaking songs. Even though Jeremy didn't fit the mold of a typical Tooth and Nail artist, Brandon knew he was onto something with the singer. He said, "I have never been this excited about a new artist since the OC Supertones." And it paid off. Jeremy Camp made some of the most successful albums that the label ever had. In the early 2000s, a guy named John Dunn was also working at Tooth and Nail Records as like an A&R guy, and he found this band called Emery. They originally formed in South Carolina, but they realized that Seattle would be a much better fit for them. After getting established in the Northwest, John brought them to Brandon, who immediately saw something special in them and wanted to put a lot of effort into making them big. Though I wouldn't say they were ever nearly as big as MxPx, Emery was still a pretty successful group for the label and became a mainstay of the Tooth and Nail catalog. John Dunn, that A&R guy, was also a member of a Tooth and Nail band, a Christian metal band called Demon Hunter, which was kind of a rebirth of an older Tooth and Nail band called Training for Utopia. Tooth and Nail Records also signed August Burns Red, which was another band that John Dunn found, and they signed Underoath in the early 2000s, and those two bands became two of the biggest metalcore bands of that era. August Burns Red were fresh out of high school and virtually unknown when they were signed. They were a discovery of John Dunn, and he really believed in them, and Brandon was like, well, you did such a good job with Emery, and Brandon said he also didn't really bring a lot of bands in, so like, if John Dunn is hardcore batting for this band, he thought they're probably pretty good. So he just kind of gave John Dunn the green light to go do whatever you wanted with August Burns Red, and it really paid off. Underoath were on a small label called Take Hold that Tooth and Nail Records actually bought, so Underoath just kind of came over as a part of that. Both August Burns Red and Underoath were signed to Tooth and Nail's subsidiary label that Brandon set up called Solid State Records that was created to house more of the heavy metal bands on the label. Along with August Burns Red and Underoath, Solid State had some really popular metalcore bands like Norma Jean and Haste the Day. Sorry about this like weird light streaks here. I'm recording this video at a very bad time of day. The sunlight's just kind of like coming in, so sorry about that. I'll do what I can to make it look remotely better. During this era, the like mid to early 2000s, Christian music was exploding commercially. The whole Christian media industrial complex was getting massive, with stores like Lifeway opening all over the country, selling books and music and videos to the Christian audience, and Christian radio was really taking off, and the major labels started to notice that, so they came calling. They started their own Christian music labels, started signing up some of the bands that Tooth and Nail Records would sign, started buying other Christian rock labels and investing in them. So I think Brandon kind of saw the writing on the wall a little bit and also recognized that the label was growing larger than they could realistically manage independently. So he sold 50% of the stake of Tooth and Nail Records to EMI. And with that, things shifted. It became more corporate and way less DIY. Some of the older fans, the people in that core community that Brandon wanted to build, didn't love how much the label changed during this period. They lost the focus on Christian bands, and EMI started treating it as an indie cash cow instead of a more community-focused indie label, which is what typically happens when small labels sell to bigger ones, but this was kind of the first and biggest instance of it happening within this Christian alternative music arena, so I think those fans maybe just weren't as accustomed to it, or even if they were accustomed to it, it always kind of sucks. Also, there were more labels in the space now who now weren't afraid to sign Christian artists because Tooth and Nail showed them that it could be successful. Labels like Fearless and Hopeless were both signing bands that typically would have only been on Tooth and Nail Records in the past. So there were signs that the good times were fading, even with some pretty monster successes happening. By 2013, that relationship with EMI was too strained to continue. EMI bought out the entire Tooth and Nail catalog, rebranding it as Capital Christian Music Group. Brandon would retain the Tooth and Nail name and was able to relaunch it once again as an independent label focused on smaller community alternative bands. Bill Hearn, the CEO of CCMG, said, "It's been my privilege to work alongside Brandon Ebel for the last 12 years. He's a great record man and has developed some of our industry's best artists in music. Together, we have built a strong catalog which CCMG will continue to develop and grow. I wish Brandon continued success as he reestablishes himself as one of the leaders in the independent music community." With all of the success that Tooth and Nail had, it can sometimes feel a little bit like a Cinderella story. Here's this guy with a small loan from his grandfather who built this empire within what can feel like a very monopolistic music industry where certain labels kind of control everything, and he was able to build this from the ground up. But some people see a kind of darker side to it. Some people think that Brandon focused on younger bands, people like August Burns Red, people like MxPx, who were in high school when Brandon signed them, and they were kind of more naive about how the whole industry worked. So Brandon was able to be a little bit more exploitative than maybe they liked. I can't really comment on that. I don't know the details of any contracts or what was said and what wasn't, but just know that some of that discussion is out there in the wider internet if you wanted to look into it. There's also a kind of darker connection in this story that I think gets overlooked a little bit, probably because it's not really all that connected, but was something that flagged for me when I was researching this. So Tooth and Nail Records in the late 2000s was based out of Seattle, and Tooth and Nail Records and the artists and the bands on it and the fans of it were always seen as these kind of like edgy Christians. Like, they weren't your Southern Baptist wearing a suit and tie to church Christians. They were Christians who would cuss and would have tattoos and just kind of weren't afraid to be a little bit more edgy in some of the stuff they said. And if you're familiar with evangelical Christianity of the mid 2000s, you'll know that there was someone else operating in Seattle who was known for that same kind of stuff, who was known for being the edgy Christians, the we're not afraid to like be a firebrand Christian. And his name was Mark Driscoll out of Mars Hill Church. And because they're both operating in the same space, or geographically, and the same space kind of within how they're framed in evangelical Christianity, a lot of Tooth and Nail Records employees and bands and artists were members at Mars Hill Community Church, I think is what it was called, and were pretty prominent members of it. John Dunn, that A&R guy, there's a video on Mars Hill's YouTube channel of Mark Driscoll interviewing John Dunn because John Dunn was an elder at Mars Hill. John Dunn was kind of hired to lead Mars Hill's record label that they were trying to start. All of that kind of came crashing down when it was revealed that Mark Driscoll was a pretty abusive person in his private life and was dishonest, and just a lot of negative things came out about him and the way that church was ran. There's this podcast that Christianity Today did called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill that's super well done, and it's a really great story. So if you're interested... Wow. So if you're interested in how that all played out, then check out that podcast. Can't recommend it enough. It's great. When all that came out, it just kind of like there's that weird dark connection now between Tooth and Nail and Mars Hill. I can't say, won't say that anyone at or associated with Tooth and Nail were aware of Mark Driscoll's shortcomings, were aware of that abusiveness, had any part in it at all. John Dunn in particular, no idea if he knew of any of that happening, no idea what his thoughts about it are. So I'm not saying that like they were involved in this. I'm just saying that like when I was researching this, it triggered something in me and I was like, that's an interesting connection that I felt like it was worth bringing up, even though there's probably not much of an actual connection there. In recent years, Christian metal has kind of died out a bit. Tooth and Nail has lost almost all of its relevance. Several of the bands purposely dropped the Christian label, like August Burns Red, which they did for various different reasons. Some of them dropped the Christian label because their beliefs changed, and they no longer felt comfortable being associated with Christianity in that way. Some dropped the label because they just didn't want to be known as a Christian band, even if individually they still are Christians. And there's also just changes within the Christian media world, right? Like Lifeway closed all of its stores, so you can't go just find Tooth and Nail albums in there anymore. There's just a lot of changes happening that it doesn't feel like Tooth and Nail could really stay on top of. So I feel like the Tooth and Nail phenomenon has kind of run its course. But they were a foundational record label of this period, and they were really important and foundational for my own music taste as well. The first song that I ever bought on iTunes was from a Tooth and Nail band. It was called Definitely Maybe by FM Static. It was a song I was obsessed with, very pop punk, very emo and angsty. I also have a very vivid memory of being on vacation with my best friend at the time. We were probably in 8th grade, walking down the beach of Myrtle Beach with a little portable CD player with one of Hawk Nelson's CDs in it. And we had the headphones. So we were walking side by side. He would wear them and listen to a song and then hand them to me, and I would listen to a song. So just like I have a lot of these very foundational, formational memories associated with Tooth and Nail bands and artists. So I owe a lot to them for that at the very least. And that's the story of Tooth and Nail Records, how they built something that was kind of really special and unique, even if it was maligned and misunderstood and hated in a lot of ways. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section below. Let me know what you think about Tooth and Nail Records. Did you enjoy them? Did you think they were cringy and silly? No wrong opinions, but at least be nice and respectful. If you ended up enjoying the video or learned something new, consider giving it a like. And if you want to learn more music history along with me, that's the point here. I'm not an expert. I don't often know a lot of what I'm talking about, but I'm trying to learn music history as best as I can, and I'm trying to share that with you, then feel free to subscribe. And also, again, huge shout out to the members of this channel. It means a lot to me that you want to like partner with me and want to be a part of this. It makes this whole thing seem so much cooler to have like that community. So thank you so much for that support.